everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 2. So today we're continuing our journey on our special Judges study, talking about God-ordained violence. Today our guest is another returning guest, Pastor Kyle Bates from St. Michael Lutheran Church in Greenville, South Carolina. Yay!
Woohoo!
Pastor Kyle was here in the spring to join us for the juicy conversation about Judas. I'm sure today is going to be just as fun, and he's going to get tired of me asking him to come on this podcast to talk about such hard topics.
I think it's a pleasure and a joy. Love wrestling. It's great stuff.
I mean, this is literally what we do here, right? Like, let's talk about all the things that no one ever wants to talk about.
Yeah. I got really good feedback, by the way, from a lot of people that were like, that was great. And I was like, was it? These are hard. So I'm glad that there are people hungry for it. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, so in here too, when we talk about all this violence that happens, right? That like a lot of Christians like either just ignore it or try to come up with like justifications, like kind of sweep things under the rug. Well, that was the old God, and like things like that, because there are just like a lot of messy things in the Bible that we just don't like to address.
Yeah. Well, this certainly is a great passage to test that too.
Yeah.
For sure.
So today we're going to talk about Gideon. So Gideon's story takes place in Judges 6, 7, and 8. So he gets a lot of airtime. I think the only person that like gets that much or more airtime is Samson in the book of Judges. So this is a big story. And God has a pretty big hand in this story. And so I'm going to read a few excerpts, but not the whole thing. Because then we'd just be listening to me read the Bible all day, which is great too, but also not totally what we came here for. So the first passage I'm going to read is from Judges 6, verses 14 through 16, and all the passages I'm going to read are going to be the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hands of Midian. I hereby commission you." He responded, "But sir, how can I deliver Israel? My clan is the weakest, and Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." But the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites, every one of them." Next passage. Judges 7, verses 2 to 7. This is my favorite part. The Lord said to Gideon, "The troops with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Israel would take the credit away from me, saying, 'My own hand has delivered me.' Now, therefore, proclaim this in the hearing of the troops. Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home." Thus Gideon sifted them out, 22,000 returned, and 10,000 remained. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "The troops are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them out for you there. When I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you. And when I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go." So he brought the troops down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, "All those who lap the water with their tongues as dogs lap, you shall put to one side. And all those who kneel down to drink, putting their hands to their mouth, you shall put to the other side." The number of those who lapped was 300, but all the rest of the troops knelt down to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 who lapped, I will deliver you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go to their homes." We're going to talk more about that. Now, the battle. I'm going to read Judges 7, verse 9, and then 19 through 23. The little chunk in the middle is a part that has to do with them going and spying and someone having a dream that basically, says that the Israelites will win. Okay. That same night, the Lord said to him, "Get up, attack the camp, for I have given it into your hand." 19. So Gideon and the 100 who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. And they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. So the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, holding in their hands the torches, and in their right hand the trumpets to blow, and they cried, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Every man stood in his place all around the camp, and all the men in the camp ran, the Midianites. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah towards Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Maholah by Tabith. And the men of Israel were called out of Naphtali, from Asher, and from all of Manasseh, and they pursued after the Midianites. After this, just as a brief, what happens in like the rest of chapter 8 in this story. After this, Gideon sends a messenger. I can't say Gideon for some reason today, and that's going to be a problem in this conversation. Gideon sets a messenger to get the Ephraimites to pursue the Midianites and to kill their 2 leaders. And then the rest of the 300 hunted down the 2 kings and killed them. Along the way, they asked for help again from men of Succoth, and they refused to help them and actually taunted Gideon. So after they killed the kings, they won the thing with the Midianites. They went back and killed all the men of Succoth and destroyed their tower. And then Gideon goes home and he takes his spoils from war, a bunch of gold earrings, and makes them into an idol, and then the people start worshiping that, and then he dies, and they go back into not in God's favor anymore. The word of the Lord.
Hooray! Yeah.
So this part of the story starts right after Deborah's song, which we talked about last week with the rabbi. And so immediately we hear that the land was in rest for 40 years under Deborah, and then the Israelites did what was evil in sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them unto the hands of the Midians. And they lived in caves and couldn't grow crops and stuff.
Yeah, which is where we actually find Gideon, right? The story of Gideon starts in chapter 6, and I think it's really interesting. Hopefully we'll bring it back to the end. There's some full circle stuff here. But where we find Gideon is in this, like you said, the scarcity, this oppression. And he's trying to thresh wheat, but not in a threshing floor. He's using a wine press
to hide it.
So I think it's a great, smart idea, because they don't care about the wine, they care about the food.
Mm-hmm.
But 2, I think that's a metaphor for Judges in a nutshell, which we'll talk more about. It's like trying to make bread out of a wine press. I mean, we're doing something that doesn't really, we're trying to do something with a tool that's not meant for it. We'll come back to that. So I do think, though, that even that first call when God shows up, or the angel of the Lord shows up to Gideon, even before you talked about this sort of violent commissioning, the first title that Gideon gets is something like mighty warrior.
Mm-hmm.
That's all that God sees in this guy, is you're going to be this guy who's going to slay and kill. And really, all of the conversation between God and Gideon to start is Gideon is not very interested. I mean,
so Gideon said something I find quite interesting. Gideon basically requires proof from God. Makes God do 3 different miracles or signs to before he's really into it. He's I'm gonna need another sign.
Yeah, well, and even that too. Even before he gets to he's got the weird dry wet fleece thing. But he has something like, "Don't go anywhere. I'm gonna go make an altar, and if you're still here, then that's proof." But also, I think if I was someone who had just read the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, this sounds a lot like Moses. Sorry, did I freeze? Did you freeze? Did we freeze?
I'm still here. I was waiting for you to
Okay, great. Oh, sorry. Speak, Lord. But it just reminded me also Moses of being why me? Why this? Prove it to me. I don't really want to do this.
Yeah.
But in the case of Gideon, it's not a call to save people in an explicit sense. It's like your call is to go out and murder people.
Mm-hmm.
And some scholars think that Gideon, like certainly Jewish scholars, say like this guy is a coward. Like pick up your sword and fight. And I don't know. To me, I'm like, well, I think this guy's got some pretty good. Like, let's slow down, God. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
So in this case, already,
Well, and part of it too is like Gideon's family wasn't necessarily like good Jews, right? Like they were not good Israelites. Like they had their own like temple to Baal.
Had their poles up and stuff, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I think God calls him to like tear it down, like as a
Mm-hmm.
sign of like,
yeah,
before we start killing, let's go,
yep.
you know, turn your whole family against you. So I don't know. I think already there's a sense in which, like even the context is like you can't really let God off the hook because God seems super into just killing.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't even use Gideon. Like he's a coward. He's hesitant. So the initiative really is on God, which is on its face pretty problematic.
Yeah, so I read a lot of really wild commentaries about this because we don't have a lot of like even some of the commentaries like I would normally go to don't have a lot to say about it because again, this doesn't never shows up in our lectionary. So I went down some like rabbit holes of some like weird commentaries and didn't come out with a lot of really great things. I came out like alarmed by how a lot of like Christians can like use this passage. But one of the commentaries said that God uses these leaders, the judges, to deliver God's people, but that God does not condone these actions. Which I don't know how the person came out with that at the end because, you know, the Lord very explicitly says to do these things.
That's that was my browser with my Gideon story up. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I don't think there's any space. I don't think there's any space for oxygen for that argument. I don't.
Yeah.
It seems pretty apparent on its face that God is not only condoning it, but God is absolutely directing this project. Yeah. And if we zoom out, I know you've got like more folks talking about the Book of Judges, but it's just going to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't get better; it gets worse and worse and worse. So yeah, I probably didn't go down as many rabbit holes. I've got one when we talk about what are some ways that we could probably redeem this. I've got maybe one good theological safety raft that I'm hoping will work. But if it doesn't, we might be treading water. But yeah, I mean, I think really, you cannot excuse or pretend the violence isn't there on God's end. I don't think it's there. Like you can't excuse it.
So what is your good theological?
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you want me to go ahead and share it, I guess. I mean, we haven't gotten to like the killing yet. We haven't even gotten to the killing yet.
That's true.
But the whole story, right, is you start. Joshua dies. He's also a general, right? And they're like, "What do we do? What do we do?" And then also you just get this place where like Israel forgets God, and so then what do? They go to broken leadership. They go to the judges, which are again like not judges that we would understand. They're judges that are like warlords, right? Mm-hmm. And all they know is violence. Or in the case of Gideon, he kind of develops the taste of war and violence, essentially through God. But the sense is that like it keeps getting worse and worse, and God says, "If this is what you want, you're going to get it. I'll give it to you. If you want to be like these people, the Canaanites, the Midianites, and whatever else that are all about war and violence and conquering, you can have it. I'll even support it. I'll give it to you." And then eventually at the end, it's like, this is the cycle. Mm-hmm. You guys keep wanting to be warlords. You keep paying the price for it because people are going to conquer you. You forget me. Then you find me because you need me. And then you're all happy for 40 years. Pretty much every time it's 40 years, 40 years, 40 years. And you forget me. You go back to it. And then you get conquered. And so like over and over and over again, this is what it leads to. Like this is sort of like the theology of like, we talk about the cross as a way in which we go like, if you guys want this, this is what you get. Like violence only begets violence. Mm-hmm. So for me, it feels like, because God is certainly encouraging it. So why in the world would God encourage violence? In some very messed up again, there's some theological gymnastics here, but like God is saying, this is what you want, people. I give you agency, free will, and I embody a generous God. But if you want violence, you're going to get all of the benefits and consequences of violence.
Mm.
And then what happens after this is they get a king, not judges. And like scholars think that's great, but like I go and read that and I go, these guys aren't much better. And then
Their
eventually
violence
what you
doesn't
get
end
is
there?
no, not at all. And then they get conquered. They conquer other, try to conquer people. They conquer each other. It's like just until you get God, saying, "All right, I will show you what it's like to be a human and to be a king, a true king." So like, it's. I think this is sort of setting up the argument for saying, you guys all want to be like everybody else, but what you have is a God who redeems, saves, and offers shalom and peace. When you're not interested in it, I'll give you what you want, but it's not what you need.
Mm.
Now that's where I'm landing. But even when you read it, you go, God did need to say that. God did need to do this. And as we get into the stuff with violence coming up, I mean, like to me, it harkens back to when I was a kid, and it's like just playing like GI Joes or action figures, where like I'm just setting up these big, like I've got my toys, and I just, oh, you fight them, and it's like these are real people with real stories and lives and families and potentials. And so like,
so that also to me, the way that like to talk about that, and that to me, like that's I think a conditioning thing for men. So like I had Barbies, obviously, because I'm a girl, but I also had a GI Joe and a Max Steel, which is the Walmart off-brand of GI Joe. And like mostly because like I didn't like Ken. And so they were like they were just the male Barbies for me, and they, hung out on my Barbie RV and my Barbie cruise ship and stuff. So like there's a conditioning that we, this may be a little off topic, but just to like talk about the conditioning of girls and boys and violence and how we talk about it.
Well, I mean, like notice that at least in this story, it's all strength. You want to talk about conditioning, right? I mean, like the only expectation is someone has to die. Someone has to win and someone has to lose. And in this particular story, I know you guys have just done Deborah, so there is obviously a female model of strength in this context, but in this story, there are really no females. This is all just men being men, boys being boys, and God being sort of the big kid in the sky who says, "Ooh, you're going to be my new toy. I'm going to send you." And like, "Ooh, wouldn't it be interesting in this game if there were less soldiers, just to make it more exciting to me?" Like nobody cares about how many people show up in this battle except for God.
Oh yeah, let's talk about that, because the whole thing is so the army so he tells Gideon to summon an army, right? So Gideon summons an army, and God's like, "Yeah, your army's too big. Like, you probably could like win by yourselves, and if you do that, no one's gonna love me, big God hair flip over here, right? Like right. I have to get all of the credit for this, and if there's too many warriors, y'all aren't gonna give me the proper credit." So he, he at God's instructions, like does these things to kind of weed out the army. And I want to read how this goes. So my current favorite commentary on the Bible is the Skeptics Annotated Bible, which is by a guy named Steve Wells, who is a scientist and an atheist. And he basically just picks apart the Bible, really looking at it from how a like literalist Christian perspective would look at it, and just tears it apart. And I absolutely love it. His goal is that like he's against all of the Bible. But I love his commentary on some of the things. It's fun to read. Anyways, he puts it like this. First, they weed out the chicken shits. Then they have the other 10,000 drink water. The ones that drink like dogs are natural born killers. So out of the 10,000 non-chicken shits, only 300 lap like dogs. Those were the few good men that God was looking for.
Wow. Beautifully said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not just like what God's calling, it's like it's the quality It's not just the quantity. It's like what's the ideal soldier?
Mm-hmm.
Man, I don't know. That's wild.
Ones
That's
that are
wild
like
to me.
so barbaric, they put their direct face in the water.
Yeah. Yeah, lapping like dogs. Yeah, I mean, like, I tried to, and I read through this. I thought maybe this is a way in which God is trying to thin things down so that there are less Israelites to die in battle. But then immediately it's like, oh no, it's right here. The whole motivation is God's own glory.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, great,
And then,
Which,
so one step further, right, in God's need for glory and violence, in verse 22, right, when the Lord sets every man's sword against his fellow. So essentially, he has the Israelites scare them and then has them kill each other.
right. Yeah.
So my whole thing, like, let's just talk about, the actions in here, right? Like, if God could just have them kill each other, why do we need to do the rest of this in the first place?
Right. Well, it's I think it's a God glory. Like, I'm gonna take this coward Gideon, I'm gonna make him a conqueror, and I'm gonna do it with 300. It's like it's all me, baby. And
Yeah. So
like,
what does that tell us about God? Like, what are we supposed to take on that? Like, how are we supposed to? I wanted, like, the best I can come up with is like, how are we supposed to rationalize or deal with this, like, bloodthirsty God who wants the glory all for themselves?
yeah, I mean, the context of this
That's the
too
whole
is
thing.
like
It is about God's glory.
it is about God's glory. It is, and specifically, these are people that at the very beginning of Judges, God said, "You need to kill all these people," and they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so now it's like, oh, now they're threats to you. So if you had just wiped them all out, we wouldn't be here. Again, though, why doesn't God just go, I'll take care of them? Like, let them all go, like go blind and live a happy life and then die in their beds, not by the sword in the middle of the night, terrified and scared. The motivation is
It's troubling.
you're my people and I'm bloodthirsty. And if you're my people, you got to be too. So lap like dogs, no chicken shits. Time to get to work.
I find that incredibly troubling.
It's true. It's, I was gonna say it doesn't feel great. But the thing is, again, what is the outcome? Like, okay, like maybe God is problematic. Maybe there's a lot of bloodshed. Maybe though, again, maybe there's something good that'll come of this. And even there's nothing good that comes of it. This guy goes on to kill people that don't help him. He beheads a bunch of leaders. He goes home. They said, let's make you king. He said, I don't want to be a king. Give me your gold. Here's an idol. 40 years later, nobody even knows this guy. So it's just blood for blood. That didn't help, and I'm really sorry.
I'm not necessarily looking for you to come up with
I was
the
gonna
all
say,
wisdom answer
it
on
just
how to
it just
how
gets
to do
bad.
this,
It just gets worse. I guess it's like you think that there might be a place where God says, "I'm gonna change my mind. I'm gonna do something different," and it's like it just gets worse. Everything gets worse.
So to me, we have to wrestle with this bloodthirsty God, because I can't, like, the commentaries that try to explain it away, that like, well, these were human actions, and God was just trying to deliver and protect their people, but like not necessarily like condoning these actions. I don't like that. You can't read the text that way.
Mm-hmm. No, in like even Joshua, it's all bad. It's all like, oh, we're free now. What? Let's start killing. Like, let's carve out a place in our world to do this. I think what's really troubling for me too.
And like that's also like even with Joshua, right? Like so them going into the promised land, right? Like people already live there, and so in order to deliver them, and again using that word deliver, God condones genocide and a shit ton of killing, right? Like that's what the story of Jericho is, right? Like those were just the people that were just minding their own business. They already lived there, but these Israelite people, by divine ordination of their own God, said, you get to have this land, therefore we must go in and kill all these people so that I can give you this land.
Right. I was going to say too, it's not just it's plenty, right? Is this God who condones and ordains violence, um, seemingly as a way to say, you poor oppressed people, I'm going to give you might to conquer your enemies, and we're going to slay them all. The problem, though, is maybe just as problematic, if not more problematic, is God also threatens God's own people with violence when they forget.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not just like God saying, Israel, get your sword, we're going to go kill. It's also like, Israel, when you forget me, you're going to get killed. So it's violence on both sides. So it's really, it's in a sense, God is saying, here's the cycle of violence, both when you are victimized and when you're the abuser. And you pay for both of it. And that feels like kind of a double helping of unhelpful God activity to me. It's like, oh, you forgot? Well, someone's going to conquer you because that's my will. And then when you're sick and tired of being oppressed, my will is I'll let you oppress them. And then later on, they'll oppress you. And so now you see the cycle. It's just over and over and over and over again with no peace, at least not long-standing peace. And this goes on for the whole book. It happens really in Kings and Chronicles too. It just happens over and over again. So that's the place where I go, surely there's got to be some sense to go like, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. What's happening doesn't work. The question I have is God doing this on purpose to get us so sick and tired of blood and gore and violence that we go, all right, we've already had our fill. How many years of 40 years of peace and then decades of war will it take before we go, why keep doing this? It's the only place where I can put my hope in it, because then we do know the rest of the story, at least in our faith, is like the cross is the dead end, like the violence of who is the abuser and who is the conqueror. And we still have that now, right? Like you've got 1930s Germany, right? They're oppressed because of they lost World War One. They then threaten people in their own population that are Jews and Gypsies and all these really underserved populations. And then Germans are defeated. Then we take the folks that have been oppressed. We give them their own place. They then threaten other people that have been there. And you see the cycle continues. Mm-hmm. You can either be an abuser or you can be a victim. But generally speaking, you'll get a chance to be both. Mm. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It continues not to work. And so you can pick a side, but like you're just picking what part of this cycle are we in right now?
I actually like really resonate with that perspective. I think because I think you're totally right. I think what I struggle with is maybe God's hand in the situation, right? Like, is this, I guess if it comes down to a question of free will, right? That God is giving them free will to say, like, you can do these things, but you have to understand what comes next. I'm keep trying to tell you there's a better way, but yeah.
The end of, and again, I don't want to spoil it for the podcast, though, the book of Judges has been out for at least a few decades. But the last line of the book of Judges is chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Mm-hmm. And if we look at it through salvation history, the only king that Israel ever deserved and needed and was offered was God, and they never took God up on it. Mm-hmm. So what happens when God says, here I am, and they go, no, we like the Canaanites a lot better, the Midianites over here. Fine, then you just do as you see fit. And what do warlords see fit to do is kill. Now, again, I'm hitching my whole wagon to this thing, right? And it still doesn't quite excuse or wash out the bad taste, which is, it does seem like God's not saying, have you had enough yet? God's saying, more, more, more. And maybe that's the weird thing that God is, I wish I was a scribe back then who could kind of understand what's going on there, but it feels to me like power and violence are the things that people want more than they want peace and true wisdom. Mm-hmm. And God offers the better, and we keep taking the worse. And to have agency and free will, God says, you get to have as much of the bad as you want until you realize it's just too bad for you. And that.
So you are actually making a case that like these bloodthirsty actions of God are actually out of love.
in a very sideways way, I think.
Yeah.
It's like like you and I both have there's young children who it's like at some point it's like you have to learn for yourself just this is not good for you. I mean, like
Yeah.
I learned in seminary, like sin is bad enough as it is. You don't need to sin and have the consequences and then get punished for it. So it's the sense of like the sin is bad for us. This thing that we do is bad for us. Forgetting the goodness of God is bad for us. John would say if we unplug from this beautiful abiding in Jesus, then we're unplugged. Like we do it to ourselves.
Mm.
And so in a weird way, I guess it is a way in which to say a loving parent who says, if you want to keep touching the stove, it breaks my heart, but the stove is on so that you can learn from it. And the problem it takes 21 chapters in this book, and then even more books of the Bible for people to figure out maybe this isn't what we need or want. But in the meantime, it costs blood and lives and peace, and that sucks big time.
Well, I think it's also something to be said too, right? That like God gives us, this free will and is trying to love us into making the right decisions. But like when we don't, it's not like God abandons, right? That says, okay, I'll come and help you once again pick up these pieces. Because I also think about like, going back to like a sort of a parenting metaphor. Because if you tell a kid, don't touch the stove, they're going to touch the stove. So if
I tell my daughter, don't put a pole to an idol in my backyard. Well, there she is. She's putting up poles for Asherah and Baal. She loves that stuff. She loves idols. But just the way it's like how do you learn for yourself?
Well, it's also
if it's top down.
You can't. There's just like so many situations, right, where you could tell people the right answer, but like they don't know the right answer until they figure it out themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I guess kind of the way that like I see this a little bit. In the perspective that like you're kind of explaining the way that God is continuing to try to basically work with what they're doing here.
Yeah. And again, like it's not even then, like God loving us to be lovers of one another and God. I mean, like that's like love has this sort of weird relationship with suffering. Right, like to truly love and to learn how to love, we have to be willing to take on the cost of suffering. I mean, that's cross, that's Jesus, that's being a parent. Like to love a child when they don't love us back or they don't see what's good, it hurts. Mm-hmm. We don't get that in the writing of Judges. We don't see any sort of side of God going, just take a moment, reader, and notice how terrible this is, and it hurts my heart. But we're going to keep doing it until they get their lesson straight. We don't get any of that. We just get the bad lessons over and over and over again. So again, like it's still problematic. Like it still doesn't make me feel like I can go to bed knowing like Judges is wrapped up. There's also like really bad, hard theology of like, well, you've got to hit rock bottom before you can go back up. And that stuff gives me the creeps. Like so, there's a bit of this you have to take with lots of grains of salt, I think. But in terms of so much bloodshed and violence and the way it's a narrative story, again, you have to keep going through Kings and all these books, but like these people just don't seem to get it. They want to be Pharaoh and Egypt at the beginning, and they want to be Midianites now. They want to be they want to have their own kings, and then eventually they want to be Rome. And in all these ways, we keep not seeing the God who's right in front of us offering us something completely different. Mm-hmm. And we still do that. We want our Christian nation, in quotes, to be like, we can draw the sword or, pull our guns out for Jesus, like as if Jesus would ever have done that. But the problem is Christian nationalism is in a really long line of awful legacies.
Yeah, I did read like one of like the deep hole commentary holes that I went on was someone using the story to talk about spiritual warfare and what God would and the examples that Gideon said, but like really they were talking about Jesus the whole time, right? And what does it mean to like fight the spiritual warfare for Jesus? Gosh. And I was like, holy, like they went like line by line with this.
Well, and now you've got people who feel like they wake up one morning and they are like Gideon. You, holy warrior, pick up the sword. Mm-hmm. And only don't take chickens with you either. We need loyalists. We need people who get the vision.
Yeah.
We only need 300 people to XYZ and take over a multitude of people. I mean, like, that's kind of the fear that many people are living in right now, is the threat of violence, political violence, violence in the name of God. All that stuff's still hanging around. It's never really left. It just sort of, again, that's the cycles. It's like, oh, we're under threat. Well, now we're going to take up our sword. Well, that doesn't work. It doesn't work. But we're not going to, I mean, the people that will still, they're still writing really strange commentaries that you're reading. So it just, that's what's so troubling. And like, the more that I put my headspace into the place of where God is looking at this going, when will they learn there's a better way?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we're like, is it going to be helpful for me then to rise up and to take arms to fight and combat and conquer those people wanting to conquer me? No, because then I'm the oppressor, they're oppressed, and then the cycle continues.
Yeah,
So Judges is just a whole lesson, you know.
So here is an existential question. If the idea then that like God sent Jesus to sort of end this cycle, but we're still doing it, where does that leave us?
It's a great question. I mean, I would say too, maybe a part of that, it's not a full-fledged answer yet. And I'm glad that you told me earlier I don't have to have all answers to all things. But I do think what's helpful is if Jesus is sort of this one incredible core revelation of who God is, the character of who God is, in that love we talked about earlier, willing to suffer. And then, but from then on, the world kind of notices and celebrates this sort of nonviolent alternative. I mean, like we have these ordinary saints nowadays too, like at diner, bars, that would rather take a beating than rise up, because there's something about loving oneself and one's others enough to say this is a better way. And the more that the further we get out, I think the ripples of this godly act in the life of Jesus inspires more of us to go, at one point do we just lose our appetite? To go like, are we done with wars now? Is it like, are we ready for the next two countries in some other part of the world to start fighting just so we can have a new headline or good about ourselves, or we can sell more guns or arms to them to make money? I mean, like, at some point, are we just going to get so sick and tired of this that we can actually open our eyes and look across the table and go, here's our neighbor? Which is, I think, again, where I love this part, this sort of full circle with Gideon's story is like, he shows up, we find him trying to do good with a tool that doesn't help him do it. Right, the wine press and the threshing floor. And at the end, they're looking for these two like generals of this Midianite army, and they find one of them. His name is Zeb. Love it, strong. And where do they find him? They find him at his wine press, and they kill him there. But there's a callback there, which is to say, why do we keep trying to be bread for the world when all we want to do is make the wine of wrath with the wine press? It's like we're using the wrong tools and living the wrong. We say a big game on Sundays, me included, like we would call for peace and justice and all these things, and then we turn around and we take that message and we don't take it to the threshing floor. We take it to the wine press. We start using this other way of living, and it only produces wrath. It doesn't produce abundance and wholeness and forgiveness. So maybe that's the place then to answer your question is, we can't do it our own. Maybe that's the whole point, is we keep forgetting God like the judges did. And so like, we do need a king, but not a king, not a politician, not some general. We need God to show up and help us to make bread, and the good news is we've just had 5 weeks of bread. Like, God is the bread, right? And to not forget that, that there's a better way and we need help. We can't do this on our own. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. But what happens when God is the one who lovingly rules around us and through us?
And it's always pointing back to God.
Even when God is really problematic. I mean, that's what's so hard. I mean, especially about Gideon. It's like, God looks like a real jerk. And that's the nicest way I can say it. So yeah, I don't know. It's been a long time since I've read Judges, so this was an opportunity to read back, and I thought, wow, what a bully. Like, God looked like a bully.
It also,
but if it points, yeah, sorry.
no. So sometimes my struggle with sort of the flow of the Hebrew Bible, right? So it is about a specific, like it's the history of a specific lineage of people and their relationship with God. But I always struggle when we come back to thinking, when we talk about our creation, that if we say that like we are made in God's image, right? Like when did that stop applying to those other people?
Mhm.
Right? Both the Midianites and the Canaanites are also are ancestral back to, Abraham, and it's
Right.
they're not separated from that lineage of being
No.
created by God.
That's the beginning, right? And then the ending for our Jewish brothers and sisters is that like all people will be gathered around the temple and the throne, and like everyone's got a spot, and like birds under the tree. So it's like the beginning and ending are so universally good for all of creation. And so how did we get to this?
Mm-hmm.
Where the same God who says, you people will draw all people into the goodness and love of who I am, but we do have to kill a few million people first. Like,
Yeah.
that's what doesn't square.
Biggest killer in the Bible.
Yeah, it's not a great look.
Well, I think so. This is where I might move to our next topic, where I think it's hard as Christians who profess, very, very much this God of love, and as God is revealed through Jesus, that how do we reconcile, or how do we approach a theology towards violence that we see in the Hebrew Bible? So I'm going to read to you some like possibilities that several Christians fall into these kind of factors, and I want like you to take your thoughts on them.
Okay.
So, one, we can reject the depiction of God here as inconsistent with the God revealed in Jesus. This considers any violent depiction of God as human projections onto God.
Well, I mean, I do think God has been taken for a ride for a long time. I do think we project some human anxiety and brokenness onto God. There's the fallibility of these words written by people, and there's some agenda there. You talk about conditioning. There's men writing this over the consent and agency of women in those days too. So like taking that into account, I think it's important. I tend to agree with most of that. I do think it's a bit of an absolute. We can just forgive and whitewash all of it. That feels problematic to me. So that's my thought on that one. Is I like the intention. I think there's some truth to it. We still project onto God who we want God to be, but at the same time, we can't excuse it. We have to wrestle. So,
Okay, 2.
Okay.
We can reinterpret the description of violence to make it less confronting. This approach really calls for a lot of literary hyperboles, calling the line killing every little thing, right? That these are hyperboles, that the physical violence involved was not the goal, but rather it was the human byproduct of the objective.
Oh man, that part about like killing every little thing or something, that like I think I just like crawled out of my skin for that part. I mean, in some ways, like what we talked about earlier, like my hope for how we kind of look at the motivation of God. I mean, like that's a place where I'm really trying to put God in a place that makes sense, like, but not to excuse the violence, but to say like, what sense does it come out of it? So I guess I'm guilty of this one to an extent, but not to the place where like God did seemingly say yes to hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people dying. Like you can't wash that away. You can't put makeup on a pig. I mean, like that, it's just there. So it is problematic. And again, I think you wrestle with it. I don't think you can wordsmith it enough to excuse it.
All right. 3. We can assert God's right to judge the world any way God chooses. It is God's right to give life and take it away.
Oh man. Wow. So God, I guess God just got a plan, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Like that
Requires a
great,
lot
great
of
theology.
killing.
A
Requires a
lot of
lot of
killing.
killing.
So all these Midianites were born to die for
Yeah.
what? Because God wanted it. Like that stuff just blows my mind. Like,
I wish people could have just
uh,
seen your face just then as you were trying to
sorry.
process that. It
Yeah,
just
yeah. I mean, it's just it's complete horseshit. Yeah, I know. I think it almost it actually I think insults what you talked about earlier, which is we are made in the image and we bear the image of God in us. We are like God, and that includes like having brains and minds that work and well enough to say, can we question why the hell this happened? Can we not bring lament to God? Can we actually be real with the text instead of just going, no critical thinking necessary? God can just kill at will, and it doesn't matter. I think that's bogus. It's offensive. I think also too, it really kind of belittles the value and worth of human life. That
Mhm.
we're just numbers. That God can just go bloop, bloop, bloop. And I know there's readings about like we're like the grass of the field, and I guess all all relative to God. I guess that's true, and yet that's not the character of God throughout most of how God sees life. God is one who holds life, values life, creates life, sustains life, redeems life. But God can just wipe out people. That doesn't square with me. And I would guess you too, based on the look you just made.
Mhm. I'm trying to keep my opinions to myself until like maybe the end. Because I want to hear everyone's opinions on these, which was very fascinating, by the way, with the rabbi coming from a Jewish perspective, right? Like they don't
Mm,
have this idea like, that we have the rooted in Jesus, where you said that's like the sort of like the end game, right? So like the rabbi
mm-hmm.
has, very different perspectives.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And also perspectives on like the current violence that's happening, and did a very good job of not talking about that, because how do you continue to reconcile those things?
Mm.
Anyways, D, last one, 4.
Oh, last one. Good, thank you.
We can recontextualize this violence within the story, seeing the violence as a context of God's bigger plan. For example, like Judges is supposed to be horrific and a dark sequel, so that we understand what comes next. That the Israelites are not given a blank check to kill whenever and whoever they want, but that it's part of God's plan to which we cannot see the full grand design. This idea of God is not nonviolent, but rather anti-violent. That God's nature is to redeem, not destroy, but will, defend against evil.
Yeah, well, I mean, like this is probably the place where I probably fall in most, right? A sense of like, what's the zoom out to see the greater story? I, God's the phrase God's plan still gives me the creeps a little bit, right? But I think we've talked a little articulate. Maybe the difference there is it's not like God's saying, "I'm going to offer this and you're going to take it." Thank goodness you're going to get. Now we all get to kill people. Um, does God like violence even to good ends? I don't think so. This is my camp. This is probably more my camp than the other three.
Yeah. My somewhat issue with the idea of like that God doesn't like the violence, but like it's the necessary like path, is actually in this story with Gideon, right? Like it wasn't just that they were driving out the Midianites or trying to deliver the Israelite people, but that God needed them to do it with so few a number,
Yeah.
to get the most glory out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's still like just really sitting with me. And I can on one hand take the perspective, well, again, God wants them to rely on God, right? And so like because their whole thing is when they stop relying on God, they fall into these cycles, they get conquered, blah blah blah. And so, part of it you could argue that like it's necessary to do that so that they can remember God's might and God's abilities and to not stop relying on God, to like really drive home that point. But at the same time, right, like this doesn't to me paint a sort of anti-violent God, because if God were the anti-violent God, it would be, hey, how do I do this with the fewest life lost? How do I do
Right.
this where it can be the least gory as necessary? So this idea of like needing, I don't know if I have a full conclusion to my statement, but a sort of a needing the glory in this it does not portray to me an anti-violent God.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And the fact that it will keep happening too, and on God's terms, like you said, like it's got to be this number, it's got to be this kind of people, it's got to be this kind of enemy.
Mm-hmm.
It does not. None of that supports an anti-violent God. I agree. Yeah.
So I think there's just still like, just like a lot. It's all in the wrestle, right? Like, and I think, that you could make an argument, right, that like that we're supposed to, right? That we continue to hold these as part of our holy scripture, because like we need to continue to wrestle with what happened and why and what to take from it today, right? And like as you were saying, what are we striving for? Are we striving for peace and justice, this kingdom of God, or are we striving for power and oppression, and are we just perpetuating another cycle of this violence?
Right. Right. Well, and like the connection again to this story, which is like, why is there needing to be blood? And then, of course, we keep struggling over years and years and years when we get to Good Friday. Like, why did it have to end this way?
Mm-hmm.
Did it take Jesus needing to bleed for us? And like all those, great other traditions that say like there's power in the blood. It's like, what about power in like fellowship and forgiveness and all these other like why blood? Why blood?
Yeah.
And I guess for me, I guess I go back to keep going like God keeps trying to pull us from this old way of like blood sacrifice, kill your neighbor for blood, all these things to place where it's like this is the last blood we'll need. This is it. No more need for blood.
Yeah.
And it's going to be my blood, not anybody else's. Like it stops with me. Yeah, but in that case, God is a victim of that. In this case, God seems to be the perpetrator of it, and that's the wrestle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just think like, as we talked about is, people sort of like taking up arms again in the name of Christ. It's like, oh man, I think you missed what Jesus has done there.
I have a working theory right now,
Ooh.
which is that that there are two kinds of people, not necessarily like the politics, the sides, but that there are some people that prefer Jesus of Nazareth and the life he lived, like this life of justice and table fellowship, like radical hospitality. And then there are people who just love Christ, like the big heavenly, powerful, universal, and never shall the two meet. Like I want big, powerful God. Like the closest I can get Jesus to the Old Testament God, where it's like all powerful, all control, the one who says, pick up your sword. And they don't spend a lot of time reading the Gospels over and over again, where it's like, Jesus said, like, don't cut that ear off, put that sword away, give to the poor. Like, they're just two different versions of Jesus, I think. And then I think the one, this Christ up in the sky, I mean, really, probably for most of these folks, that's the God that's so easy to wrap into Christian nationalism. Because it's like the deist God that, like, we're kind of based off of, which is like, can't see them, don't really know what they're about, but we can use the name, it sounds nice, and now we can just anoint a king or a president or a governor or whoever it is in the name of Jesus, this Christ, big Christ out there, who has nothing to do with the Jesus we read about in the Gospels.
Well, that version
right?
of it also is like continues this like conquering piece, right? Of taking I think some of the gospel stuff and also some more of what like Paul said, right? Is this idea of, you sort of get into that supersessionist theology, right? Like if this is the way, right, that like it then is God ordained to protect it, to promote it at all costs, to put on this armor of Christ in order to, yeah, I don't know if I don't think that Christ's message like needs to be protected, right? Like I think it's more
I mean, it speaks for itself. I mean, like it
Yeah.
does its own work. Yeah, no, I agree with that.
And if like done correctly, right, there's not a need to protect it because it is laid bare for everyone to have a piece
Hmm.
if they
Yeah,
want it.
I mean, it's self-evident. I mean, like that's a place too where like you can't, like I mentioned earlier, like you can't come away from a non-violent, like an activist protest or something where it's like there is no violence, like it is truly anti-violent, and walk away going, those people are evil. It's like no, they just took a club, or mace to the face. It's like, and they did it because they believe in a Jesus that is not God ordains you to the sword, but a God who says like, I'm willing to absorb it because love is stronger than hate. I mean, like, and what's sad is I think it's more and more churches feel like that's so hard, and it is hard. It feels impossible that it's just easier to go to this other Jesus, this Christ who can be like God, who ordains armies and violence and has a plan and doesn't have to worry about suffering. And if I just am obedient to that without critically thinking, all will be well.
Yeah.
And it's just not true. And that gets back to the cycle of like, we just can't learn it or outlearn it. So
That we just continue in those same, I'm, it's really resonating with the circles of violence thing.
Yeah. And what's the only way you stop it is by saying it ends with me. But that's the problem too, is like a few weeks ago in the Gospels, it was like, like what's the Messiah look like? It's the one who says like, I'm going to get betrayed and suffer and die so that this stops. And like, Peter's like, no, you got to be a conqueror. You got to be a king. You got to be the one meting it out, not receiving it. And it's like, you've missed the point. You're still in the cycle.
Yeah.
And we're all in the cycle. So to say like, let's pull you out of it is terrifying because it makes too much sense. When it's my turn to get to punish people, I'm ready for it. But in the meantime, I'm taking my punishment. What a life. And I think that's the place where like I hope in my own faith that God, in the God of Judges, is saying, do you see what the cycle looks like? It's a terrible ride. And wouldn't you want to get off? Like, wouldn't you want to get off this ride?
That's also just like a great, I think, promotional advertisement for why everyone should read Judges.
Yeah, maybe so. That's right. Yeah. Well, I look forward to the 10-foot pole branding. The visual you'll put together. I can't wait. It'll be great.
It's very exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kyle, for joining us on this on this journey and this hard conversation. We have more to continue to kind of unpack some of this, and a question that I'm asking in our study guides, like at the beginning, where are you at in your sort of theology around violence in the Bible? And then we'll ask it again at the end. Is it nuanced? Is it changed? Is it, do you feel worse about it, better about it? And to see like how we can grow through these conversations. Which reminds me, so everyone, that there are accompanying study guides for your congregations, for your bar buddies, and however else that y'all, take in the 10-foot pole. If you go to 10footpolepodcast.com, you can find the Judges Study Guide materials there, as well as just the normal questions that will be in the information on the episodes themselves, wherever you listen to podcasts. It's in the drop-down menu on Apple or Spotify and stuff. And that to hear more and to stick with us, you can always learn more about us on our Facebook and Instagram at 10-foot pole podcasts. And of course, please subscribe and follow wherever you listen to podcasts. The 10-foot pole podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care until next week when we continue.